Hello, everybody, and welcome to my Guilds of Ravnica Boros draft guide. Today, I am going to be going through how to draft a good Boros deck in Guilds of Ravnica. Obviously, this is only my first impressions, but I do think that these tips can help you have more success early in the format. I was doing a color-by-color set review, but I found that to not be as helpful just because you are overwhelmingly likely to be drafting in a guild. And because there are 5 guilds, I'm going to try and do 5 videos, one for each guild, highlighting the key cards that you need to be aware of and how to draft those strategies. However, this video does take quite a bit of work, so I don't want to do it if it is unpopular when I could be doing something else. So in order for me to make my next archetype guide, I will need some help from you folks. If you enjoy the video, be sure to click that thumbs up button, and if the video gets 40 thumbs up, I will proceed to make another Guilds of Ravnica guild draft guide. But without further ado, let's get into the Boros guild. And right off the bat, you're going to see the Boros guild is an aggressive, assertive deck. So what that means is that you're going to want a great curve, and then you're going to want to have ways to push through damage once you have stalled out the board a little bit. We're going to go through those one by one, but first we're going to talk about the curve. Essential to any aggressive deck is going to be the mana curve. This is just a rough estimate of what you want to have in a curve. Normally the 1-drop slot wouldn't be so high, but in Ravnica there are a decent number, Guilds of Ravnica, there are a pretty decent number of good 1-drops. You don't really, and so if you can get 1 or 2 of the good 1-drops, then you're very happy to run them. 6 to 8 2-drops is pretty much, that's not optional. If you don't have at least that many 2-drops, you're not going to have a functional aggressive deck. You're not going to, if you don't have a 2-drop on turn 2 as an aggressive deck, you are basically in just very, very bad shape. Then the 3-drops, you can have several 3-drops. The 3-drops are generally pretty strong, so having those is nice. And then you don't want to have too many expensive cards in your aggressive deck because you want to make sure that you have a smooth hand that can deploy out its curve. Ideally, you'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then maybe end the game on turn 5 or something of that nature. But 2, 3, 4 is basically something that you want to have, or at least 2, 3, and then 2 2-drops, something of that nature. So we're going to go through the curve each slot at a time, just highlight the cards. This is actually every single common or uncommon 1-drop, and I do want to talk about which ones I think are better than others. I think that of these 1-drops, I think that Healer's Hawk and Goblin Banneret are the best ones. Hunted Witness is also pretty good. It's close to those ones, but I think Healer's Hawk is really good because if you mentor it up, it becomes a 2-powered flyer. Mentor obviously being the keyword mechanic for Boros. I'll cover it when I get to my first card with Mentor, which is Goblin Banneret. So I'll just talk about Goblin Banneret for a second. Mentor is whenever the creature attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature with lesser power. And the reason I like Goblin Banneret is because in the early turns, it gets in for a couple points of damage, and then in the little bit of later turns, it can trade up with their 3-drop, even though you have to put some mana in, and it can buff up your other creatures thanks to Mentor. And because it gains 3 power with Mentor, it can buff up your 2-powered creatures, which means they turn into 3/3s a lot of the time, which just makes them a lot more powerful. So I think Goblin Banneret is going to be a nice little 1-drop creature. I think Healer's Hawk is going to be a great creature to mentor, and that's why I think it is going to be a pretty nice card to have in your aggressive decks as a 1-drop. It also has evasion, so it can get in for some points of damage. Normally, I'm not a huge fan of 1/1s for one that don't do a ton, but I think in this case, Healer's Hawk has just enough going on for it that it's going to be nice. Hunted Witness is kind of nice as a 1-drop just because it can go in. It can be mentored pretty easily, and then if it dies, you still get a soldier token, so you're going to still have some board presence if you do alpha attacks, attacking with everything. Hazda Marshal I don't think is as good as these other ones. I just have this and Torch Courier for the sake of completeness. I don't think Hazda Marshal is as premium because if you're attacking with a lot of creatures, and one of them is this 1/1, a lot of the times they're just going to eat your 1/1 or eat some of your creatures. But if you can assemble a good curve out and back it up with combat tricks, Hazda Marshal can definitely help you snowball a game out of control. And then Torch Courier I don't think is particularly playable. I don't know how good the ability is going to be, but there are some decks that could potentially want this type of effect, especially because it just makes your top deck's a lot scarier later into the game. So I'm not going to exclude Torch Courier. Some decks are going to want it as just another aggressive 1-drop. But the 2-drops are really where you have to find yourself if you want to be a good aggressive deck. And Red-White in this format, Boros, has a lot of good 2-drops. This is only 5 of the 2-drops, but I think they're the 5 best ones, or 5 of the best ones. There's several others that I could not list, but I didn't want to list every single 2-drop because that's a lot of cards. But I think these are the best ones. If you look at the gold cards, they're both 2 of the gold cards are uncommon, and then the Fresh-Faced Recruit is obviously a common. But the 2 gold cards, Boros Challenger and Legion Guildmage, are both excellent. They're the exact type of card you want in your deck, and they're one of the reasons that you do not want to be running less than 16 lands in your aggressive decks in this format, because these two cards have pretty high color requirements. So if you have copies of these cards, you want to be able to cast them on turn 2, so you want to have at least 8 sources of each of your color to be able to cast these gold cards. So a lot of the time you will want to run at least an 8-8 split. You're not going to want to go below 16 lands, which is also pretty rare in other formats. Ornery Goblin, just a really kind of annoying creature to block because it does do the damage before it would be dealt damage itself, so they can't block it with 1 toughness creatures, so it's pretty nice at attacking. Fresh-Faced Recruit having first strike as an attacker is really nice. It really reinforces the aggressive theme of Boros. And then Skyline Scout being able to gain flying in the late game is just a really nice effect. So these are some of the premium 2-drops to be looking for. You'll run a huge number of 2-drops. If you could have like 4 Skyline Scouts, 4 Fresh-Faced Recruits, you would probably take that a lot of the time. I mean, it's just really good to have 2-drops. You can't have an aggressive deck without having 2-drops. So I think that it's really essential to have a ton of these 2-drops, hopefully in this category. There are some other ones that are decent, but these are the best ones. So keep that in mind. Next up, we have 3-drops. The front-running 3-drop is Skylight Legionnaire. It is a common, and just a 2/2 flyer with haste that can come down on turn 3 can really put the pressure onto the opponent. I really think it's going to be a good card, and one that you need to prioritize if you want to be playing Boros. If every single one of your 3-drops was a Skylight Legionnaire, then you would be very happy, just because the evasion is really nice, and having haste means it can threaten them out of nowhere. The two commons that are pretty good. Wojek Bodyguard is another card that really makes you want to have a curve out, because if you can't attack with this on turn 4, then you're in pretty bad shape. So you really want to be going 2-drop into Wojek Bodyguard, and then because Wojek Bodyguard is a 3/3, it's probably going to buff up your 2-drop, and then on turn 4 you're going to be attacking with 2 3/3s, which is going to end up being pretty effective. So Wojek Bodyguard is definitely one to consider, but you can't play it if your curve isn't good enough. So you will probably be able to get it for your Boros decks, and it is definitely the type of card that makes you want to prioritize having cheap cards, and that's why having 2-drops is so important. Blade Instructor is just a mentor creature. It's not the greatest because it does only have 1 toughness, so a lot of the time it will die to their 2-drop if you attack with it, but it is still a fine 3-drop. Fearless Halberdier I'm listing just because it's a fine, like, if it just to emphasize the point that if you need a 3-drop, Fearless Halberdier can get the job done, but if you have a better 2-drop, like if you have a premium 2-drop, you're definitely going to play it over Fearless Halberdier. But Fearless Halberdier is a card that you can grudgingly play sometimes. And then Rock Charger is, I think, going to be excellent in this format, because it having low power might seem bad for an aggressive deck, but because of the mentor mechanic, a lot of the time you're going to be able to turn Rock Charger into a 2/4 attacker. So if you have like a Wojek Bodyguard or a Blade Instructor alongside your Rock Charger, not only does it help your Blade Instructors and Wojek Bodyguards get in for damage, which is also really good with Blade Instructor because Blade Instructor has low toughness, so it would die a lot of the time, but it's going to be able to buff up the Rock Charger and make the Rock Charger into a threat in its own right. So Rock Charger works really well with Mentor, and so I think it's going to be a very high priority for the Boros decks. Next up, we have 4-drops and higher. There are several that are pretty nice. True Fire Captain is a beating. It's really kind of hard to cast, so it makes it's a little bit difficult to cast exactly on turn 4, because having exactly 2 mountains and 2 plains is hard, but there are some dual lands in this format, some guild gates that you can pick up to help you cast your cards on curve. Maybe on turn 3 you could go 2-drop plus a guild gate, help you cast your True Fire Captains and things of that nature. Inspiring Unicorn is a pretty nice card. I think one of the reasons it's so good is because it really incentivizes your opponent to block it, because it's buffing up all of your creatures, and it's only a 3/3 after all. So it's one of those cards that gets really good if you have some combat tricks, because your opponent's going to throw a block onto it. You're going to eat their creature with a combat trick and be able to put them in the same spot the next turn where you're buffing all of your creatures by +1/+1. So Inspiring Unicorn, if you have it in your deck, you would like to put a couple combat tricks in your deck, so prioritize those a little bit higher. Hammer Dropper is a just 4-drop, 4 mana 5/2, so it's another one of those ones that's going to get blocked a lot, but it is a pretty big creature. So if you can get it through it to deal damage, maybe with the rock, the 3-drop that I just talked about, the one that gives flying. If you can get in with the Hammer Dropper, it's really good. It's also good with combat tricks because they're incentivized to block it. So it's just a fine 4-drop. Hellkite Whelp is just a 5 mana 3/3 flyer that can start pinging their blockers to help your other guys get through, so it's just a fine card. And then Intrusive Pack Beast, I'm talking about this one last because I do think it's going to be one of the best white commons. I think maybe the second best white common, just because it's so effective on turn 5, and it having like decent stats is just a bonus, because the effect of tapping 2 creatures is sometimes worth a card all by itself in an aggressive deck, and the fact that you get a 3/3 body attached, and which is far from irrelevant, is just great. So because on turn 5, your opponent has oftentimes had time to deploy a couple blockers. So maybe they played their 3-drop, maybe they trade off 2 drops, then you have your 3-drop and they have theirs, and then on turn 4 you play a creature, they play a creature, and then on turn 5 you play your Pack Beast, tap down their 2 guys, attack them for like 7 damage. That's just a huge swing. You've also added to the board. Any future Pack Beasts are going to be great. So I think Pack Beast is going to be a big deal in this format, and you're going to be very scared of Pack Beast if you are a deck that is defensive in this format. So I think you definitely need to prioritize Intrusive Pack Beast as one of the highest of the 4 cards that you're playing that cost more than 3 mana. Intrusive Pack Beast is one that you're pretty happy to play. You'll probably play like 3 of them. They also work pretty well in multiples, and yeah, I've talked a lot about this card, but I really do want to emphasize that I think Intrusive Pack Beast is going to be great, because oftentimes an aggressive deck would play this effect anyway, and on turn 5 is about the time that you want to do it. You don't want to use this on like turn 2 or anything, so the fact that you're getting a creature along with an effect that you would already oftentimes want at this point in the game is really nice. Next up, we're going to talk about pushing through the damage. We already covered the curve, but there are some ways you can push through damage. That's the second element of a Boros deck. If the board gets stalled out a little bit, they play a pretty decent blocker, like they play a 1/4, you don't want to just be dead. So the 3 ways you're going to be able to push through damage is by casting removal spells, casting combat tricks, and then there's a special category that I am calling push cards. But I'll get to those more when I get to that section of the review. So first of all, there's removal spells. There's great uncommons like Conclave Tribunal. One important thing to note about Conclave Tribunal is your convoke creature, when you convoke, which is a mechanic I haven't talked about yet, basically you can tap your creatures for mana to cast the spell or add mana of that color, for casting mana of that creature's color. So basically, you can cast it before 4 mana if you have a couple of cheap creatures. It also incentivizes curving out, and the creature doesn't have to be summoning 6. So you can play like a 2-drop and then immediately tap it to cast Conclave Tribunal, which is pretty useful to help you like be mana efficient on turn 5 and things like that. So be aware of that. Then there's in addition to Conclave Tribunal, there's Luminous Bonds, which is like the best white common. It's just very good removal, gets rid of anything. And then there's some other uncommon removal spells. There's also some common removal spells, but these are just like the premium removal spells. I have this one card flipped sideways. Intervention is the removal half of the card. 4 mana, deal 3 damage to any target, and you gain 3 life. It can target the opponent's face, but it's also just pretty flexible removal spell. Justice Strike can kill a lot of blockers, though it doesn't kill blockers that have like 1 power, 4 toughness, so it's not a guaranteed removal spell, but it does only cost 2 mana. Lava Coil is pretty excellent. So removal spells are one of the best ways to push through damage, because if you say have 3 creatures on the battlefield and they're holding all of your creatures back with 1 blocker, and you kill that blocker, all of your creatures are immediately unlocked. So if you have a lot of really good removal in your deck, a lot of the times you won't want to trade off your creatures, because you'll be able to get in with all of the creatures once you've cleared the way by getting rid of that blocker. And yeah, so be aware, you do want to have several removal spells in your deck, but I'll talk about that later in the deck composition part. You definitely want to have removal, though. Prioritize it highly, because you can oftentimes get 2-drops and 3-drops in those cards because they're very interchangeable. Like the difference between the best 2-drop and the worst 2-drop is not as high as the difference between an average 2-drop and a Luminous Bonds or something of that nature. So definitely prioritize removal, because it's much harder to get. After removal, combat tricks are the type of card that is one of the biggest pulls to a deck like Boros, because the deck like Boros doesn't need all sorts of crazy card advantage engines, because it's trying to kill the opponent so quickly. So these are the only 3 combat tricks at the common or uncommon level. Combat trick being an instant speed way to interact with combat. There are some sorcery effects that buff creatures and some enchantments that buff creatures, but basically the combat tricks are what you really are looking for. And the combat tricks 1 by 1. Take Heart gives a creature +2/+2. Sure Strike gives +3/+0 in first strike, and then Integrity gives a creature +2/+2. So one important thing to note, if you're playing against Boros, these are the combat tricks these are the only combat tricks they can really have. So if they make an attack, just think, is the creature going to get +2/+2, or is it going to get +3/0 in first strike? And how can I play around that? So that's the type of thing that you need to be aware of if you're playing against Boros. If you're playing with Boros, one of the reasons that the combat tricks are so much better in Boros is because a lot of the time you're going to be on the front foot because you've been prioritizing your curve out deck style. So if you go 2-drop into 3-drop and your opponent misses a 2-drop, say, they tap out on turn 3 for their 3-drop, and then if you attack with both of your creatures, they pretty much have to block, or they're just taking like 5 damage. I'm just assuming that we have like a 2/2 on turn 3, and then like a 3/2 on turn 3, and your opponent plays like a 3/2 of their own. So basically they have to block, and then you use your combat trick for 1 mana or 2 mana to trade with their 3-drop, and then you deploy another threat, and they're just hugely disadvantaged from that point on. So that's why combat tricks are so good for aggressive decks and not as good for control decks, because if you're casting a combat trick when your opponent has mana up, they're going to oftentimes be able to punish that and cast a bounce spell or a removal spell at instant speed in response to punish the combat trick. But if you are an aggressive deck and you have these combat tricks, playing while your opponent is tapped out is hugely efficient and basically turns them into 1-mana removal spells a lot of the time. So be aware of that, and if your opponent on like turn 4, when they have 7 cards in hand, doesn't cast a creature, and you're starting to pressure them, maybe don't use your combat trick in combat because your opponent might be holding up an instant speed removal spell or something of that nature. Other than combat tricks, there are push cards, and push cards are several categories. First of all, Intrusive Pack Beast, I really want to talk about this card, again, is a perfect example of a push card, because when the board is stalled out, or you get your opponent to a really low life total, push cards are the cards that get through those last points of damage. They push it in. So that's why I call them push cards. So you play your Intrusive Pack Beast, get in for a ton of damage, win the game. Legion Guildmage is another card I've shown. One of the reasons why it is a premium 2-drop is because it acts as a push card. You can spend mana in the late game to like end of turn, tap their best blocker, and hit them that way, or you can just start dealing 3 to them every turn and start pushing through the board stall that way. Cosmotronic Wave is one of the like premium examples of like a stereotypical push card. Deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control, and they can't block. So if you're on a board stall and you've just been playing a creature every turn that's just useless and getting stumped by their guys, but you have a Cosmotronic Wave in your deck, you know that you're going to be able to push through eventually, so your opponent actually is under some pressure to kill you. So Cosmotronic Wave is pretty nice in that regard. Also, it's not completely useless against decks because it does do 1 damage, so you can sometimes kill some of their creatures. So I think Cosmotronic Wave is definitely playable in this format if you need cards to help you push through those extra points of damage. Inescapable Blaze is another good example. Direct damage to the face is a pretty good push card. If you can get them to a low enough life total, it means that if the board stalls out, you have a way to win the game still, because that's the downside of playing this type of deck, is that if you get them to 5 life and then they stabilize, and you don't have any of these push cards, it doesn't matter. They're just going to eventually beat you because you don't have any ways to get through damage. Flyers are another great example of cards that can push through board stalls. That's why Sky Knight Legionnaire is great. And then the final card that I highlight here is Candlelight Vigil, because sometimes, usually earlier on into a board stall, you can put an aura onto one of your creatures, and then your opponent won't have a good blocker for it, and that 1 turn of attacks can be the huge difference. So if you have a 3/3 and you put Candlelight Vigil on it to make it into a 6/5, your opponent all of a sudden would have to triple block it to kill it. So you can take that opportunity when your opponent's tapped out to throw Candlelight Vigil onto your creature. I don't love Candlelight Vigil. I think it's a little bit inefficient, but if you have some Mentor creatures, it's pretty good with Mentor, and it definitely has some synergies. Just be aware that you are going to get 2 for 1 when you play this a lot of the time, because they'll have removal spells, so don't just slam it into open mana, and be careful with how you choose to play it. But Candlelight Vigil and other auras are the type of card that you will play if you need to push through damage sometimes, if you can't get any of the other push cards, or if you just want to be super aggressive. Finally, I'm just going to talk about what a Boros deck is going to look like. It's just very basic. You're going to have 15 to 18 creatures. You pretty much need that basic threshold. 15 is even a little low, but you need to have a ton of creatures. You're going to want to have 2 to 5 combat tricks / removals, just because you need to have, those are basic. Basically, combat tricks and removal are also push cards, but they're not like specifically push cards. They're in a different category than a push card, because a push card pretty much only helps you get through extra damage a lot of the time, or some of the time. But basically, combat tricks and removal are essential to this type of deck. You want to have like 2 to 5 effects that are combat tricks or removal. You ideally would have like 3 removal effects, 3 combat tricks, or 3 removal effects, 2 combat tricks, and like 17 creatures or something. And then push cards. One of the things about push cards that I do want to note is that they can fall into the other categories. So as I said, combat tricks and removal can count as a push card, depending on what type of effect it is. then your creatures can also help you push through the damage, like the 2-drop that we showed, and the 5-drop that taps 2 creatures also pushes through damage. So just keep in mind that when you're building your deck as a Boros deck, if you get towards the end of the draft and you don't have any cards that can help you push through a board stall, and you see like a Cosmotronic, whatever the heck that card was called, prioritize those ones a little bit higher at that point. So that's just generally what a Boros deck will look like. Very simple, very straightforward, but still very effective. And then here's just a couple things that came to mind when I thought of a Boros deck. One of the things is buffing your mentors is something that you can prioritize. So if you have a combat trick and your opponent is if you're trying to calculate whether you have lethal, you can potentially like cast your combat trick before going to attacks so that your mentor creature can buff your other creature and that you can kill them or something like that. So keep in mind that if you buff your mentors, it may change the math because it buffs your mentor and buffs the other creature. Know your pushers, which is basically another way of saying know your outs in a situation. When you're playing an aggressive deck, one of the most important things to do is to play with tempered aggression. So if your opponent is at 6 life and you know that you have a spell that does 4 damage to the opponent in your deck, sometimes it's worth throwing away a couple of your creatures just to force through those damage so that if you draw your final push card, you can kill them. Or if you know that you can like tap down 2 of their blockers, maybe don't trade off as aggressively. And then the final tip, curve is king. If you are playing a Boros deck, you are going to want to curve out on the opponent and kill them basically because your curve is so good. So that's the huge advantage of the Boros deck, is that you're prioritizing your curve while other decks are prioritizing like card advantage and things like that. If you can curve out on your opponent, you can win a lot of your games. So that is something that I just wanted to emphasize one last time. But yeah, that is going to do it for this guide. I would like to thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to click that thumbs up, and that will help propel me into making another video for another guild. As these are quite time intensive, I don't want to do it if people don't want to see them. I can just make other types of videos. But yeah, I hope you do enjoy the video. If you do, be sure to consider subscribing to the channel as well to get updates for whenever I post new content, including future how to draft a guild videos. But yeah, that is going to do it. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.